Hi, this is Diane Kresh, and we're here doing an oral history with Robert Brosnan, who retired recently as the Director of Community Planning and Housing and Development. This is the first of a series of oral histories that we'll be doing to capture the essence of what building the community that we know as Arlington is all about. And I'm joined today by
Jack Belcher, Director of Technology Services.
So let's start. State your full name.
My full name is Robert Brosnan, otherwise known as Bob.
Okay, and you recently retired from the county. You worked for the county for how long?
I worked for the county for 38 years. I started as an intern in 1977 and was hired permanently in 1978.
Okay. Now, why did you move into planning? What were your career plans up to that point, and what made you change your mind and go into planning?
Well, I think like a lot of people out of school, I didn't have any career plans. So, and thanks to my dad, I went to Georgetown, undergraduate degree in business, and I had worked in banks in New York in the summers, which we'll come back to talk about why I like planning later. But I got a job at Riggs Bank a couple of years out of school, and I think I was there for about 2 years. And besides the fact that everybody was an attorney and I wasn't an attorney, I just didn't really like what I was doing. And so I, like a lot of people, I took some time to think about what I liked. And interestingly enough, there was 3 things. One was I'd spent some time up in Cooperstown, New York, and my dad was involved in a hospital, and we used to stay at a hotel up there all the time. And I was interested in hotel management because I thought the guy who worked there was really cool. He was in Cooperstown in the summer, which is one of the most beautiful places, then worked in Florida in the winter. And then I also liked hospital administration because of what stuff my dad was doing with the hospital. I wandered down to George Washington University, and right next to one of those programs was the planning program. And I stopped in to talk to them, and I said to myself, whoa, this is what I want, because I've always liked cities. I grew up outside of New York. When I was old enough to kind of start getting around on my own, I used to take the train in New York City and just wander around. And so that's really what got me into it, my love of cities, and happening to wander into the planning program at GW and ask them some questions. Now, I happened to end up going to Catholic University, which is how I ended up getting the job here. But it was really my love of cities and places and just, visiting things and seeing how things are built that got me into planning.
Okay, so you started off outside of New York. So how did you end up in Arlington?
Well, as I said, I went to Georgetown, and so I really never went back to New York. Arlington was pretty simple for me. When in the 70s, DC wasn't doing any planning. They weren't investing in planning. It seemed to be a federal government city. The rest of the city it was coming out of riots. It was having a hard time getting its act together. And there were really only 2 places that were doing urban planning. I was not interested whatsoever in going out into one of the suburban places and working out there. So there was really only 2 places, and of the 2, one of them being Alexandria, Arlington was the one that interested me. As luck happened, I happened to have some contacts through the school that got me the job here. But Arlington was an easy choice for just what they were already doing.
And what were they already doing?
Well, the early planning for Metro had already taken place. I had lived here 3 times during the 4 years that I was at Georgetown, so I was familiar with what Arlington was. We didn't come across the river all that often or wander into Arlington, as Jack probably knows, but I was familiar with what was going on. I saw what was going on in Roslyn. I lived in River Place, which was in Roslyn. I think a lot of people have come through Arlington and lived in River Place at one time or the other. And from going to school, I already understood what the significance of planning and transit-related planning was. And so I could see that there was some pretty cool stuff going on, but I could see that it was already more urban and heading more urban than the other jurisdictions.
Can you define for us very quickly smart growth, transit-oriented design?
Smart growth, I think the simple answer to the smart growth question is it's building communities that, and they can be a variety of communities. They don't have to be high density urban, but communities that are close to jobs or have job, working and living opportunities and transportation opportunities in close proximity, so that you can get out of cars. You don't have to get out of cars, but you can get out of cars, and you can use your infrastructure more efficiently, so that you don't have to constantly expand water, sewer. You don't have to constantly. I was thinking the other day when I was thinking about this is Jack's effort to bring broadband to Arlington. You're doing it in a fairly confined area. If you had to serve a Fairfax County and connect all those individual areas, how much harder it would be. So it's concentrating development where you can walk, you have job opportunities, living opportunities, shopping opportunities, but you're also taking advantage of the existing infrastructure. And then you're also able to save open space. And today, where money, federal money and local money is hard to come by, kind of utilizing existing infrastructure and investing in that as opposed to expanding new infrastructure, I think is a pretty critical thing.
Okay. Let's talk about your career then as a planner here in Arlington. Talk about some of the projects that you began with.
Well, let me, the one story I like the best as a start was when I was first hired, I was hired in the Community Development Block Grant Program, which still exists, and it was focusing on the low-income areas of Arlington, of which there weren't many, but there were 3 that qualified. I worked for them for about 2 years, but my first or second day as a new employee, somebody brought me around the office to meet the other people, and we weren't that large at the time. When I went into this one room, there were these drafting tables, 2 drafting tables, and there was these plans on the drafting tables. And on it were the plans for what we call Twin Towers, but were the Arlen Towers, or where USA Today and Gannett were, the 2 silver towers down in Roslyn. And when I looked at that, I thought, okay, this is where I really want to be. So that's what really kind of told me I was in the right place. So that was my kind of first introduction. The first project, big project I worked on, which is ironic given where it stands today, was Ballston Common. And that was redeveloping Parkington into a mall, which at the time was a fairly big investment. We actually, one of the few times in my life here, we actually put money into it. We renovated the garage. We still own the garage. We put money into the infrastructure around it. We don't do that very often, so it was a big investment. The irony of it is now they're about to tear it down and redo it some 30 years later. So it shows you what the evolution of one's career could be. The second one I worked on was another mall, which was Pentagon City. That was pretty controversial. I got to meet all of my friends down in South Arlington, many of whom are still there, still remember me. But it got done, and it was a very successful mall, although it was somewhat suburban still. The next 2 that I was involved in, I think I'm more proud of. Pentagon Row, which is on the backside of Pentagon City, really was one of the first in the country and the first in the U.S. to have the mixture of retail on the first floor and residential above it. And it was a much more urban, built to the street, a nice park or a plaza in the middle that has ice skating in the winter and just other stuff in the outdoor stuff in the summer. And because it combined the retail and the residential, very active. It was also a bit lower, and the scale was pretty good to the neighborhood. And then the next one is Market Common, which was in Clarendon, was the old Sears store. The Sears store itself had been reused for a number of years, but the backside was a lot of parking and their old tire center.
Right, I remember.
And I mean, that had some uses. There was a bike shop in there for a while, but I mean, for all of the acres of parking, it had been underutilized for about 15 years. We had Home Depot come in. And Home Depot was very interested in being in Arlington. When you think about it, there's really 7 Corners, there's one there today. There's no hardware stores in Arlington. It was actually, we had done a retail study about a year before that, and that was furnishings and hardware stuff was one of the things identified as leakage in Arlington, given already how much development we had. People had to go outside of Arlington. And so the planners thought that the Home Depot would be a good idea. We figured we could handle the traffic, we could handle the loading and things like that. we thought it would be an economic boon. That wasn't the same perception that the community had, which, you know, is one of the few times in my career that I say, thank you, community.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, you know, that was right. And they opposed it. I made a lot of new friends, some of whom are still around during that process.
Was that a surprise when they, I mean, because you had,
you know, I don't remember whether it was a surprise or not. Looking back at it, I'm not surprised. At the time, I remember we got a new director from CPHD came in shortly after that, and she and I went out and met with the community to try to, the perception was we had really blown it with the community and we need to rebuild our trust with them. But nonetheless, that went away. We started to work with, Home Depot had a home expo that was more urban and it was more furnishings than it was lumber. And even that didn't fly. And I don't think it was but a year later when Dan McCaffrey, who was a developer out of Chicago, but has been very active in this region, had already done a project up in Chevy Chase. And he approached us about a mixed-use project. And I remember going on a tour up at Chevy Chase. It ends up a lot like Market Common. It had, on Wisconsin Avenue, it had retail. It had some big box retail that was downstairs that was buried on the back side. There were townhouses to the neighborhood. Eakin Young and Taub, who ended up doing the townhouses, and Market Common had done the townhouses up there. We were all impressed. So we worked with Dan McCaffrey, and this was one the community was really supportive of. I mean, it's probably one of the easiest projects to get approved and get built. And I think it's been very successful. That and Pentagon Row taught us an awful lot about how residential combined with retail can really create place, even more so than office. You know, up until that point, you know, office. We wanted office. Roslyn had a lot of office. Well, where do people go in Roslyn to just kind of hang out? Well, Market Common was a place that people went to hang out. Right. And that's one of the things we learned and then applied to the rest of Clarendon. So I think that's why that one was so important, because it was transformative for how we were even thinking about planning going forward.
It's interesting that we could pursue a little bit more, talk a little bit more about Clarendon, because it's certainly the Market Commons and it's certainly award-winning. And people, no matter where you go, say, we have all this infrastructure in place, but boy, if we only had something like Market Commons in Clarendon. But there was another part of Clarendon which is of interest, is that area where a lot of subway construction took place and a large Asian community had come in and set up businesses and were quite prosperous at that time. Could you talk a little about that and how that played in the overall development of?
Yeah, I think I think we were known as Little Saigon for a while.
Right.
You know, one of the reasons restaurants were what we saw in the well, first let me back up a little bit. Clarendon was the commercial center for Northern Virginia for a long time, until Seven Corners was built, and then malls started going further and further. Clarendon was, so there was this infrastructure of retail, some of which was demolished for the development of Metro, some of which just had become vacant and underutilized because people and businesses had moved further out. We already had in our zoning ordinance that restaurants didn't need to park. And that's why Clarendon became a place that all these restaurants went to. They were one-story buildings, sometimes two-story buildings. It was easy to ventilate them if they didn't have ventilation for cooking, things like that. And they didn't have to park, which there was no parking anyway, so that was, and so the investment to go in there wasn't that great. So in the late 70s, early 80s, there were a lot of Vietnamese restaurants along the north side of Wilson Boulevard, and they occupied existing buildings. They were actually, Nam Viet is still there. It's you know, it's one block off, but it's been in Clarendon forever. Some people think that Arlington chased the Vietnamese community out by redeveloping. Actually, they were gone before much of the redevelopment happened in Clarendon. I think that was just part of the transition in the Vietnamese community as they moved further into the suburbs. Eden Center in Falls Church developed, which was a large concentration of Vietnamese restaurants and community. I think that's why they went there. They were initially replaced by a variety of other ethnic restaurants, again, because they didn't have to do a major reinvestment in the building just to open another restaurant. And it wasn't really until mid-90s where Clarendon started to develop that you started to see those same places taken over by some of the bars and restaurants that we see today as the character of Clarendon changed. So I think it was just part of the transformation over time of both community and Arlington that led to that change.
Contrary to Clarendon, Shirlington.
Right.
And when you think about Shirlington, I mean, I remember when I first came here, it was somewhat retail. It was like a strip mall in many ways. They had a big box wholesale. I think it was Bell or Best.
Most people don't probably remember those catalog stores.
Right. I do.
You and me. I don't think Diane remembers.
No, I remember. Sadly.
What the transformation that took place there? I mean, I can understand Clarendon when you've got a subway. You get the subway going through it and stops, and people, and it wasn't an urban commercial district to start with. But Shirlington, I mean, it was sitting on an off-ramp of 395. And
Well,
what you've created there.
I think that was part, I mean, part of it, yeah, it was sitting on an off-ramp of 395. But it also had great bus access. I mean, 395 has one of the highest occupancy, I won't call it bus rapid transit because it doesn't have its own lanes, but it has express buses, and a lot of them already got off in Shirlington. But I think it was also we had a concentration of people living around it, and you had a place that was properly zoned. So it did take a little bit of planning and working with Federal Realty, I think it was at the time. I think it started with Oliver Carr, but Oliver Carr, I think, changed their focus over time, and Federal Realty picked it up. I think when Shirlington really took off, however, so there was some redevelopment of it. There was some I'll call it stick-built, which is 4-story residential behind Shirlington. But you hadn't seen any of the high-rise and some of the other new expanded commercial. That really came in when we worked with them to help build a Signature Theater, a library.
Right.
We had them, we let them use some of our land in return for building a parking garage, some of which we got to use. So a public-private partnership began to transform it and expand it. And that's when you saw the newer high-rise residential, you saw the movie theater, you saw some of the new restaurants and other retail that came in. And then we built a bus transfer facility at the off-ramp, as you call it. So I think it's a great example of how anybody can build transit-related development that doesn't have to rely upon an investment in heavy rail, because not everybody can do that. But you have great bus service, you got carpooling, we got slug lines down there. There are jobs in Shirlington as well as there's housing, there's activity. So that much like Market Common is really an active place, a place that people like to go, sit out in the streets. A lot of restaurants primarily down there. So
well, it created a sense of place and
Right,
there,
right.
and I noticed a similar transformation with Westover.
Exactly.
I grew up so not far, really, down Washington Boulevard to Westmoreland Street. So I was very familiar with the Westover neighborhood growing up, and it's completely different. I mean, there's a real tight community. Right. There are things to do. The Westover Beer Garden attracts families and young people and old geezers like me. So I'm just talk a little bit about that village concept.
Yeah, so let me talk about the beer garden for 1 second, because that's another, made many new friends and enemies. I mean, that was another example of something that staff was resistant to. And I don't think we understood what a community asset it was. And there were 2 or 3 people who were complaining about it, and so it got the attention, as happens in Arlington, by some squeaky voices. And we were reluctant. I wouldn't say reluctantly. We were supportive, but we put a lot of conditions on it and stuff like that. And the world didn't end when it opened. And in fact, you're right. Whenever I go through Westover, it's people are flowing out of there and they love it, and no one's complaining. So it's uses like that can help create place. What I like about Westover is that we talk about the urban villages in the Roslyn-Ballston corridor and the Jefferson-Davis corridor, but when we talked about Shirlington already, Westover is not. I mean, that's a different size urban village, and it is the centerpiece of a lot of residential around it, single-family residential around it. It's got garden apartments. It's got affordable housing, and it's got this concentration of retail that many people walk to. Although, again, bus service is coming through it. It's easily connected from other places in Arlington. So I look at it as another successful urban village in Arlington, not one that we planned to create but happened kind of just more organically.
Sure.
And the thing to watch going forward for my successors and stuff is to not screw up Westover. I mean, that's really the thing. It's a great, you mention Westover to almost anybody and they know what it is. You got Lost Dog Cafe, you got the beer garden. My son took me into the grocery store there and showed me all the beers they had, just the amazing choice. And it's got a post office, it's got a library, it's got a school, it's got everything. It's got airs, yeah, it's got a hardware trinket kind of gardening store. And a farmer's market. So I mean, it's a great community asset.
Right.
So you talk about an interesting thing about identifying what the community wants, what the needs are. And we're known to be a very participatory government. Everybody participates in the consensus making. Yet you're walking a fine line balancing the interests of the developers, which I imagine at times are maybe contrary to what the interests are of the community that's advising you. How did you balance that so that you could achieve what you achieved? Because I imagine there was some positives and there was some challenges in an environment like that.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is in the areas that we did extensive planning in, where we worked with community to develop plans, we would advise developers such that there wasn't tremendous conflict. Because my advice always to them is you have a plan, you follow the plan, and it's going to be okay. Now, yes, sometimes developers come in and are a little bit more resistant, but usually we're able to bring them along to comply with the plan and not be that at odds with the community. Where we run into that conflict more is where it's unplanned, and somebody comes in and wants to do a development. Turned out to be a great project, but over on Lee Highway, the Bergman's Cleaners, where Dan McCaffrey again came in and wanted to redevelop that. That wasn't planned for anything. So that was a harder project. We were able to work with him. He was able to work with the community and get a project that actually, as I look at it today, is pretty good. It's got a Mom's Organic Grocery in it, nice scale. It does have a high-rise building, but it kind of sits over on 66. It's going to have great views. So I think that's where it's unplanned, it's more difficult. Good developers either have the capacity to work with neighbors or they hire someone who has capacity to work with neighbors.
Right.
I've always said that one of the jobs of the land use attorneys is not to kind of fight with us over legal issues, but is to kind of know what the plans are, know the community, and get out and work with them. Nonetheless, there are some times where we come out on different sides with the community. As plans go along and new people come in, sometimes people forget what the plan was and what the purpose was. So the developer comes in, what's this?
Right, sure.
And I think that's where we have to continually educate people and keep the plans in front of them so they know. But I think eventually when it comes down to the conflicts, it just takes conversation and time. It lengthens the process. I think that's. I think our staff have always done a good job working both with the community and the developers. But I don't think we ever kind of advocate overly for the developers against the neighborhood. We try to find that common ground.
So you mentioned the staff, and when I look at the list of accomplishments you've received, achievements, the awards you've got, it's amazing. Go on the web page, it goes on and on. It's just award after award.
Of course.
And it's certainly a credit to you. But also the staff your colleagues. How did you attract the level of staff that you had there? Because they all are some of the best professionals that we have in the government.
Well, I think it's somewhat similar to the answer I gave to why I wanted Arlington. The difference now is we do have competition from Washington, D.C., and so Washington, D.C. does attract a lot of planners. They're investing in it, and there's a lot of stuff going on in Washington. But Arlington over the years has developed that reputation. Those very awards are kind of what helps attract people. Not to pat my own back, I think people like to work with me and for me, so I think that helped attract them. The kind of work we did, the awards we got, it's interesting, but people used to ask, well, am I going to be able to make presentations to the board? They come out of other communities where it's only the planning director that can ever make the presentation. And at least for me, I always liked that interaction. And as I went on, I just assumed not do the interaction and have the planners do it, you know. But they were looking for that. Other places wouldn't. Alexandria, as an example, doesn't really do that. It's the senior staff that do it. So that was the other thing. The fact that we invested in planning. I mean, and this is to the managers I've worked with and to the politicians that were here over the years. They believed in planning. They invested in planning. They gave us the resources, and so, you know, they would see that we'd have GIS, and they'd see we have all this great technology, you know, thanks to you. So I think that, you know, that made it easy. The thing that makes it hard is the living costs here. So we often found that somebody else would be moving to work for the federal government, and we'd get the spouse or the significant other. Sometimes it was people who happened to be living here but working somewhere else that we'd attract back in. So I think it's the awards, you know, it's probably my style, it's the government, our governance style, and the kind of work we were doing that has attracted great staff, and there are great staff upstairs.
I'd like to go back to the smart growth principles discussion a little bit. The Metro story is oft told in how it was transformative to this community. And having grown up here, I can measure my own childhood and early teen and young adult experience against that backdrop. Do you think a Metro project that would be that transformative could happen today?
I think it would be difficult. I mean, you can see the battles that Arlington had over the streetcar and Columbia Pike. You can see the battles that Montgomery County and Prince George's County are having over the Purple Line. You know, the Silver Line got approved, but that was now 10 years ago, and B, it was severely modified over what might have been the preferred thing. I think there is both a local kind of resistance to it, i.e. Arlington, but I think even more importantly, there's kind of a regional and national kind of anti-investment in infrastructure thing that would make it tough. Arlington came, I mean, the Metro in the region in Arlington came about as much because of political leadership as because of any professional staff doing it. And so it really, you know, they have to be willing to take a chance. And in this atmosphere that we have today, I think it makes it difficult for them to take that chance. And there's a lot more competing need for that money. I think that's one of the reasons why smart growth is good, because you can concentrate the money in the existing areas, but there's a lot more competition for less and less resources, I think. So I think it would be very difficult. I wouldn't say absolutely not. I like to think maybe there was a hope, but I think it would be pretty difficult.
Well, you spoke earlier about the need for constant conversations and reminding people of what the goal is. Your department, perhaps more than many others, has that blessed place of dealing a lot with the elected officials, commissions, as well as the citizens. So you were at that for some 30 years. How were you able to keep that in balance?
That's a good question. I don't know. The thing they don't teach you in planning school is politics, you know, and so that's the thing you have to learn. And there are some people that are good at it and some that never quite get it. You know, there's some people that are always going to sit in their office and say, well, if they'd only let us do, you know, what we want to do. I think I understood early, or I got to understand, and you know, by probably year 10, understood pretty well that, you know, they were the policymakers. We were not the policymakers. You know, we were professionals. We were, you know, both educated and through training and experience have some pretty good ideas, but we're not the policymakers. And that's something that I tried to pass on to staff. And the other thing I tried to pass on is it's not win or lose. I mean, we go out and do our best that we can for what the plan is and what we think is right. But at the end of the day, again, policymakers are making the decision. If you want to influence the policymakers, and that's the kind of after the meeting or before the meeting stuff, and we do. That is one of the places where, again, I think why people get attracted here is, you know, we spend an awful lot of time meeting with the board in their conference rooms, and that's when you can really have the more candid conversations with them and remind them about what the plan is, and try to make your case more so than you can out in the public meetings. But when you sit in those meetings, there's senior staff always there, but there's junior staff often making those presentations and comments and cases to the board. And so, again, people like that. They like that interaction. And I'm sure there's a whole lot of employees in the county who just assume never see the county board, but I think the planners, I mean, they kind of get that that's part of how they're going to get stuff done, so I think they get it, and then we help train them.
Well, they have a real vested interest in realizing the vision for the community, and that's pretty exciting.
The hours your staff put in, though, I mean, just watching them, I mean, night after night in meetings, and it is really a taxing.
Yeah, and it's gotten more so over the years, and it's something that I'm kind of sorry about, and I wish I could be around. Arlington's going to continue to develop the way it does, but trying to go back and improve the processes and make them a little bit easier, so there's less time on everybody's part. I mean, my staff spent a lot of time there, but the planning commissioners and the board spent a lot of time also. I mean, if we could just make it easier for people, maybe we could focus on other important things. So. I know as I left, the new director and the new planning director were working on some things, and I have some hopes that they may be able to make some headway where I was not able to. Again, changing politics and changing political leadership will have some, will play in that a little bit too.
So thinking about the successes, there have been many in this community, but having gone to Georgetown, like you, and looked across the river at Brosnan, it always struck me as probably an area that didn't have the planning that should have been there. Is that the case? I mean, it seemed like...
Well, it had the planning. I guess, now you look back on it, I think Roslyn's a good example of how we've evolved. So, and if you go on the, I think on the Smart Growth Journey video, there are some graphics of the early plans for Roslyn. So there were plans. First of all, the I-66 right-of-way was supposed to split right through Roslyn, so Roslyn wouldn't have even really been there. It would have been separated by this grade-separated highway. So way back when, they got them, I think it was Stoneburner, got them to relocate it so it kind of swooped around Roslyn. If you ever wonder why it takes that big curve and comes around, it was because it was supposed to go straight down to Memorial Bridge, but it was moved. There were plans, and I just finished reading Dr. O's World's Fair. I don't know if you read that,
Yes.
just because he died recently, and I was like, GM's Futurama in the World's Fair in the 30s in New York, had all these above grade highways and above grade pedestrians. Well, that's what Roslyn was supposed to be. It's in the 60s, not the 30s, but that's what Roslyn's plans were, and that's what developed. So you'll remember that when you used to go to Roslyn, you had all those above grade pedestrian bridges, and actually, if you knew it, there was retail up there. Just that not a lot of people knew it, and that was the planning then. So come forward some, we've evolved. The first plan for Roslyn was back in the 60s when they did that stuff. Then when I came in 78, I think the second plan was approved, and that was kind of sort of an as-built plan, so it didn't really get into urban design stuff, and we weren't really focused on urban design stuff then. We were focused on economic development and just development. The next plan was 1990, and that was the first plan that we did after we had what was called the mid-course review. The mid-course review came about because a few developers and now some of the politicians were beginning to, and staff were beginning to say, hey, wait a minute, can't we get this better? We've been just getting development, but couldn't we do it in a better way? And so we had 3 architects come in and spend a weekend here with what's called a RUDAT, done by AIA.
It's called a RUDAT?
RUDAT, R-U-D-A-T, and I forget what that stands for, but ULI does some today called Technical Assistance Panel, so there's an easier, but you bring in a variety of experts who aren't getting paid for it, but just come in and kind of help you envision things. And so they made a lot of recommendations about Roslyn primarily, because what had happened in Roslyn is you had no street front activity. You had all garages and blank walls, and you had some parking above grade, which we're still getting today, and then it was all about the office floors that were from grade like 5 up to the top, and it was all about views and things like that. There were restaurants sprinkled around Roslyn. My wife worked for the Nature Conservancy, and so when she worked there, because of the people that she worked with, they knew where they were, but some of them you had to walk through garages to get to.
Right.
So there was nothing at this, and there was no reason to stay there. There was no residential. There were no places for people to go to. So the 90 plan tried to change that some. But we still found that the building, so Waterview was done after the 90 plan. I'm trying to think of what else. Waterview was probably the major one. And it still was designed so you could look at it from the Georgetown waterfront, but the 19th Street frontage in Roslyn still was kind of a door that they had to have a canopy so you'd know where the entrance was, and blank walls. And so the new plan that's been approved by the board and the projects that we've been working on since 1990 and through this new plan really try to change that and really try to, introducing residential, which you've begun to see anyway, because we've learned that residential is really a key to making it a place where people are going to stay. You know, they're not going to, even Wall Street has residential happening in it now. People aren't clearing out. And then as there's more people there in the evening, they're demanding more things, and there's a more market for it, and there's places to go and things like that. So Roslyn, our thinking of Roslyn really is the evolution of our thinking and planning, you know, across the board, that it really is more about paying attention to the details and getting the street front right and getting places that people want to go, and, you know, you'd want to show your relatives, hey, let's go to Roslyn. You wouldn't do that today. You might in a few years when Central Place is complete, when the metro station is not just a cave that you have a hard time finding your way to, and there's more open space and the sidewalks have been completed. I mean, one of the great transformations is going to be introducing a new street pedestrian way through 18th Street, so you get smaller blocks, one-waying of Lynn Street and Fort Myer, or two-waying of Lynn Street and Fort Myer, so that you can circulate around, you know, better, and it's not just whooshing cars through to the, you know, to DC, because we're between Fairfax and DC, but saying, hey, this is a place where you might want to pause and stay. So I think it's a great evolution in our plan. It wasn't that we didn't plan it early on, but it just was reflective of the era.
Well, and your thinking changed.
And our thinking changed.
I was wondering, too, about historic preservation, because, again, having grown up here, I can remember what Arlington looked like in the 50s and 60s. And there are, frankly, few vestiges of building styles. I mean, maybe in some of the neighborhoods, although a lot of people now are taking the cute little bungalow and exploding it and making a McMansion, which I have some trouble with. But that's important, too, because that roots us in our history and our heritage. And so, again, how do you achieve that balance between building new skyscrapers, mixed use, retail on the ground floor, and the 20s and 30s, either business or residents that also define Arlington?
Well, I think that it is hard. It's a challenge, as we said early on. Some of the cool stuff in the corridor was demolished because of Metro. Some of the cool stuff in the corridor was demolished the first time we ever mentioned historic preservation. One or two buildings, G.C. Murphy's and Hahn's Shoe Store being two of them, they went right out and tore those suckers down. I think Clarendon is the best example we have of how you can mix the two. You know, some of it came about just because it came about, and some of it came about because of the plans. We were the first jurisdiction in the state to have transfer development rights, and so the Clarendon plan is built around transferring development rights within Clarendon, so you can preserve some of the buildings on the north side of Wilson Boulevard, for example, where the Vietnamese restaurants were back in the day. Those have all been preserved, and that density has been moved to some of the new buildings that didn't have anything to be preserved on it. And you'll see it there. You'll see it in the old library. I'm sorry, the old post office.
Well, we preserved the facade of the Walter Reed School too for the library.
Right. And then when you move out into the community, a lot of times it's just a facade thing. I mean, we have a hard time. We have designated neighborhoods, and so they have to go through a process if they're going to change. Maywood was the first one, and I don't think Maywood actually has seen quite as many of the big teardowns and expansions as some of the others. The one where I sort of get it and sort of don't get it, and I think my staff would tell you that my I was never the biggest historic preservation proponent. I got it in some cases, and I was, working with them really, really well. And others, I just sort of wondered. And a lot of them were the garden apartments. I mean, I got over the years how important Buckingham was and how important Colonial Village was, not because of the buildings per se, although the historic preservation staff, my staff, loved the buildings. But it was kind of how they were laid out in the open spaces and the trees and things like that. So we managed to preserve almost all of Colonial Village and much of Buckingham. We've got a few others out and about in the community that are on something called a historic resources inventory. And that was an important step for us, because what we often found was historic Affairs and Landmark Review Board or some historic interest would come out late in the process and say, hey, what about if can't we preserve this, can't we do this, that, the other thing? Well, at that point it was almost too late. If we had known when the developer first came in, you could work with it. So we did an historic resource inventory which categorized things by very important, sort of important, kind of not so important, and that list is out there. And so the planning staff are working with developers know ahead of time when somebody comes in, hey, wait a minute, this is something I got to call historic preservation staff in, at least have this conversation.
Sure. Have
the conversation with the Historic Affairs and Landmark Review Board, so it's not at the board meeting the night of you're expecting approval or a decision, and all of a sudden it blows up. So I think, again, it talks to getting into the planning and having those conversations. But it's not, nobody's had great success with historic preservation across the board, I don't think. It just takes a lot of work.
Well, I was very disappointed to see the demolition of the Blue Goose. I mean, I know it had its own lore and all that.
Didn't you get some of the panels?
I'm supposed to get some panels, absolutely, yes.
So on that subject, and again, we're trying to get an oral history of what happened and has happened in Arlington. And one of the things that you educated me on is the whole question, you mentioned it briefly, density. Trading density for amenities. And many in the community may be not aware of how that works. I certainly wasn't, and you explained it to me. But depending on what side of you're on in this, the amenities are good for the things you get, like affordable housing and art and parks and such. On the builder's side, there's a tendency to say, you're loading on things that I would not have to pay for elsewhere. I was wondering if you could describe how that works and what your thoughts are in terms of how encouraging that is. Is that a incentive or a disincentive for new construction in Arlington?
Well, we call our zoning process an incentive zoning process. So I like to think that we take that into account when we develop what the density is. So I'll use Roslyn as an example. We put...
explain what density means, because the audience probably wouldn't know it.
Well, how do I explain? I mean, density is the measurement. At its simplest, it's the measurement of the size of a building. It's misleading often. We have units per acre is one way you measure it. So you can have, if you have an acre and you can have 24 units an acre, then you can have 24 units on an acre. If you have 2 acres, then you can have 48 units. It doesn't necessarily tell you how big or tall or where the building's going to sit on it, but it tells you how many units. That's important from a variety of perspectives, but I don't know that it helps anybody understand what the building's going to look like. The other measurement we use is called FAR, or floor area ratio, and that's the number of square feet that you can build on the site relative to the site. So again, if you have a 1 acre site, which is 43,560 square feet, then a 1 FAR, you could have 43,560 square feet of development, and a 2 FAR, so forth. Again, not telling you really anything about how that building is going to look, but strictly a measurement. And the measurement is important because it allows you to forecast, how much development you're going to get, so you can figure out how much sewage you have to have and things like that. So it helps from a variety of perspectives, and it is a measure. So there is something in place, but it doesn't really help people understand what something's going to look like. I think that height and other things play into that. But incentive zoning is you build your density by these amenities. So in Roslyn, all the things that are in the plan that we're calling for, you have to earn your way up to the 10 OFAR that you can get as a maximum by providing the amenities that are called for in the plan. And developers, for the most part, understand it. So if we're clear up front about what the expectations are in return, they can make their decision when they're buying the land, that they know what it is. When it becomes a problem is when we start adding on during the process.
Okay.
So that's and that's where the community comes in, because the community either doesn't, sometimes won't understand what was in the plan to earn their way up, or when even if they understand it, that's not what they would like to see. You know, they'd like to see a park where
Right.
where the Parks Department hasn't called for a park and doesn't have money to maintain it, or they might want a library
Sure.
where you don't want a library and we don't have the money. Or one of the things, not big box, black box theaters have
Right.
been around. Some of them planned, some of them not planned. So it's that debate over what is the proper amenities and why are you choosing affordable housing, or why are you choosing this or that versus what I might want. That is the problem, or often the problem. And then when that's a surprise, or when it's added on to the what the developer expected in the beginning, then that's when it becomes a problem for developers. So I think overall, I mean, you still see people developing, so I think we've got it in balance, but I think that's what's become more of the conflict over the years. And it's easier in a place like Brosnan where you have, or Crystal City, where you have this higher density and a lot more room to play than it is when if you're doing a project in Shirlington, for example. The density in Shirlington on each individual parcel isn't very much, so it's hard to create that value, if you will. So I don't know if that helps answer your question. I know it's a tough area.
Controversial.
Yeah.
One of the things I've been thinking about too is that Arlington, as much as I love it, it doesn't have like a central kind of town square. It has many neighborhoods, each of which has its own character and vibe. But there's sort of not the central place where everybody goes and watches the fireworks or gets together at certain times of the year. I mean, for fireworks, obviously, you go over to Iwo Jima if you're not ready to brave.
I guess, or
Longbridge now, that's true. So any thoughts on why that kind of central core from which there would be spokes never really took hold?
That's a good question, and I think in my mind we always viewed it as courthouse, except we've never had the money to do it. So the board advertised recently a new plan for courthouse, where I think to a large degree that's going to happen on what is now the parking lot out here. But if and when that happens, because that's an expensive proposition, it'll be interesting to see if it does draw that, if it does make that draw. The other place that I've always thought myself is Quincy Park.
Oh, sure.
It's if I remember my map right, it's almost dead center in Arlington. It's got a library. I think why that hasn't been turned into something more than it could be is the conflict we see between the kind of passive places that we want to attract people to do the kinds of things you were talking about, and the active recreation we need. So part of the problem with Quincy is it's partly owned by the schools, and it's got a baseball diamond on it.
Right.
We've got soccer fields, we've got tennis courts, we've got a softball field.
We're screening films there next week in
Okay,
the evening.
But I think that has some opportunity, but that would take a community conversation. So I think in the short run, my hope is that it's not short because it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's probably going to be 5 years or more. Courthouse could be the place. I mean, it's the seat of the government. Got a lot of people living here. What the thing it's missing? It doesn't have Clarendon. It doesn't have the restaurants that Clarendon has. It doesn't have Market Common. It doesn't have the places to go. That's the thing the courthouse is missing right now. That I think the Courthouse Plaza plan really could provide, and whether that proves to be the place you're talking about or not, we'll see. But I think it has the best chance of achieving that.
I had a question about, and I didn't want to leave this out on the open, this the Kettler Arena. The whole question of how that happened, how you're able, because you've got an ice rink sitting on top of a parking garage.
Well, I think you'll have to invite Barbara back because she was very much involved with that. But I think that was again one of those public-private partnership opportunities we had. We had this parking garage, which is I think always been, people thought it might be a cash cow. I think it's been the reverse. I mean, we got to spend a lot of money on it. And so, as I understand it, we were actually, I had worked with Dick Patrick, who was one of the part owners of the CAPS. And I think he's the one that does most of this kind of stuff. And they had for a long time been very interested in Arlington. And we had talked with them about the North Tract before Longbridge Park came about, when we knew we were going to get it from the rail lines, from the railroad company, but hadn't yet. That just wasn't going to work for a variety of reasons. So he continued to be interested, and somewhere along the line, I think it was the guy who was with economic development.
Terry Holtz.
Tom
No.
Newman.
Oh,
Tom Newman.
Tom Newman, who was
Yeah.
very involved in coaching
Hockey.
hockey
Right.
and stuff like that, also had been working with Dick Patrick. And I think those two, as I understand it, came up with that idea. Hey, here you got parking, you got the infrastructure in place, the strong elements of smart growth. Let's put this here. And by the way, the community can get skating time. And I know from the few friends who have kids who play hockey, you got to travel all over the
Yeah.
region at god awful times to get any
Right.
ice time. So here's so it was a great joint use of this parking facility. As a matter of fact, they had approached us recently about moving the Wizards facility
Right.
over here somewhere too. I don't think we found any place that would work yet, but I think a lot of their players also happen to live in Arlington, which made it made it easy. So I think those kind of creative public-private partnerships are a great thing to do, and if you can do it where you I mean, it's like the library and a Signature Theater down in Shirlington. What a great
Sure.
combination of things to put there.
so as you look back over your 30-plus career, were there favorite projects? That's part one. And part two, lessons learned. What would you want to pass on to the next director? So we'll do the easy one first. The easy one is the favorite project.
Well, I think we talked about some of them. I mean, I think Market Common and Clarendon. I mean, I think that's my favorite. I think I said in the earlier video I had done that one of the things that made me proud, or I was kind of surprised at, but made me proudest, is I helped create places that my kids wanted to go to. Then that's and by the way, I should say that's one of the best parts about being in planning is you have a hand in helping create places and you can see what
Sure.
happens. I mean, that's one of the reasons, getting back to your very first question, that's one
Right.
of the reasons I like planning. And so Market Common, Boston Commons Day, Pentagon Row, those, they're out there, you see them and you're happy with them. Now, there's also some I haven't been quite as happy with. There's that hotel, Quality Inn, I think, at Glebe Road and I-66 at Washington Boulevard, where the developer, had this grand idea and
where the Indian restaurant
yeah,
was.
yeah. I
Across
did that.
from the
I did
Japanese
that.
auto. Oh, okay.
Every time I drive by it, I'm reminded. As a matter of fact, at my retirement, they showed some things they showed some pictures of things I'd rather forget, and that was the first one. So, but you get to see, things you have to live with, but also things you're very happy to live
Sure.
with. I think lessons learned is do the planning. A lot of places don't do the planning, they just get development in, and you're trying to review development, and it's a battle. It's a battle with the community because they don't know what was planned for it. It's a battle even within the government because everybody's going to ask for what they want, and so you end up working at odds. So continue to do the planning. Don't just invest in doing development review because I think it works at odds. I think that continuing to work with the community and educate them and have good contacts with them. I mean, you need to be able to call people in the community you understand what's going on because, it is their community.
Sure.
It's few of the planners that work in Arlington actually live in Arlington. A few of them do, but few of them do. So it's not their community. They're working with the community and the board who are the ones elected to make the decisions to help develop community. So
Right.
if you don't work with them, again, you're working at odds. So I think those are the two things that I would pass on. And then the continuing education. So as people, we're a very transient community. I think becoming less so over the years, but still a lot of people move in and out. State Department, military, working for the government. And so
you always have a new crop of people that you have to kind of help continue to educate as to what the plans are and where Arlington's heading. And as I left, they were working on this community facilities plan, which I had personally hoped could do a lot of that for,
Sure.
you know, to help kind of bring at least the people who live here today along to, hey, this is where we started out to, this is where we're heading, and help them to understand it.
Okay.
So what's Bob Brosnan's legacy?
What's my legacy? You know, I'm very happy to drive through Arlington and see everything that's there. You know, it's not my personal legacy. I mean, that's the thing. You know, you asked me what I did. I helped work with the board and the community and this great staff, and the developers that came in to you know, build good things. And I guess that's what I'd say my legacy
You
is.
did a great job.
Yeah. So thanks, Bob, for entertaining us this morning. It was an interesting interview. Thank you for joining us. This is our first in a series of oral histories that Jack Belcher from DTS and I from Libraries will be doing with notable personalities who have helped make the community of Arlington.